All right, I'm Larry Cutler, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Baobab Studios, and we're reinventing traditional animated storytelling using virtual reality.
Let's start by talking about what attracted you to this brand new medium to begin with.
Well, it's interesting. I actually did VR research as a grad student 20 years ago at Stanford, and so I saw the promise of VR a long time ago, and at the same time, I also saw that it was really much more a science experiment 20 years ago. And even though there was also a lot of hype back then that VR was going to be the next big thing, but it really it wasn't ready for prime time. It wasn't productizable, at that point, just from a cost standpoint, technology standpoint. And so I ended up going into computer animation, and I was there in the early days at Pixar on some of the earlier films, and then later at DreamWorks, where I met Eric, our fellow co-founder. But at the same time, I've always been kind of waiting for when VR would be the right time, when all of those hurdles would be overcome. And when that happened, when we saw where the Rift was going early on, it was clear that the promise of VR was here, and VR was going to be transformative to a lot of industries. But of course, we're really excited about how VR can transform entertainment, and really fundamentally, you are just immersed in the world around you. You're part of that world, and so it creates storytelling opportunities that just are quite different and don't exist in previous mediums.
Are there similarities in exploring the early days of computer animation to what you guys are exploring now in the early days of VR storytelling?
Definitely, and in some sense that really is, I think, what's attracted so many of us to VR, is that in those early days of computer animation, it was constant experimentation. We didn't know how to solve so many of the problems of how to make an animated, a computer animated scene, a computer animated short, and ultimately a computer animated film. And we feel very much that we are in the early days of VR. In terms of VR filmmaking and VR, creating VR experiences. And so each day we're kind of solving all of these technical problems, all of these creative problems. We're having to define, what is that cinematic language? What tools do we have in our toolbox that we kind of took for granted, when you're filmmakers? We have in film, you have 100 years of experience that you can build upon, whereas for VR, everything's brand new. But that, for the right set of people, is really exciting. It's scary and exciting all rolled into one. But it brings back my feelings I had in the early days when I was at Pixar. Where probably every day there was at least one time during the day we were like, I have no idea how we're going to solve this problem. And then you'd go and think about it and talk to a bunch of people, and then you'd come up with 10 ideas and 9 wouldn't work, and and you'd keep kind of going through that process. And we'd ultimately end up with something where, when you're sitting in a review, with the director, you're like, oh my God, that I never, we never would have thought we could have achieved that.
What are your thoughts on the fact that the creations that you guys are building out now, the stories you're telling, are being done with video game engine technology with Unreal Engine 4?
Yeah, I mean, what's amazing about, about VR is that we're bringing together sort of experts from games and experts from films, and kind of creating something that is an amalgam of the two. And from the film side, I think the biggest daunting challenge for us is we are used to having shots that we can carefully compose and then render over several hours on offline render farms. And here we have 11 milliseconds. We're rendering 90 frames a second, and that 11 milliseconds has to render both the left and the right eye. And so we are incredibly lucky to be able to build upon all of the technology that's gone into these game engines, where they already have a pretty good sense of how to do real-time graphics. And I was blown away initially at what you can actually accomplish in 11 milliseconds. Now, that being said, VR is really like a game on steroids. And so we had to kind of build a lot of technology to be able to take all of this game engine technology, but then make it so that we can actually have characters that have that same level of believability and subtlety that you'd expect from a feature film, and all the same cinematic lighting and and effects that we would expect from a film, yet running in real time and having characters that are responsive to you. So the challenges are slightly different than your typical game, but but we're really drawing upon a lot of the same principles.
And just as an aside, the film industry is heading more and more towards real-time 3D.
Yeah.
At least at this point for previs, but still it's kind of heading in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, what's amazing is VR is being used in the early stages of the pipeline, such as previs, because you can get an immediate sense of what the world's going to look like. But at the same time, there's a huge push to have films, have animated experiences that are actually just running at 24 frames a second in a game engine, and I believe that is where at least kind of one future of animated films is going to be going. And then in that case, when you're actually saying, hey, I want to tweak what this character looks like, or I want to tweak certain parameters of the story, you can have a real-time response in terms of that final look.
What did having Oculus Touch and the ability to have arms and hands open up creatively for this story?
Yeah, I mean, with Invasion, we started the project before there were hand controllers. And so we ended up being really excited about the idea of you being part of the narrative. And that's once we had that realization, that first of all made people react in ways that you just would never react in a film. So you have Chloe the bunny hop up to you at the beginning of Invasion, and you're there, and Chloe will look you right in the eye, and everyone looks right at Chloe, and people react to her and they wave at her, and a lot of people will mirror her behavior, reach out and try to pet her. And so that feeling of connection, being part of the story, was there even without hand controllers, without sort of being able to much more in high fidelity track your user response. And then with hand controllers, we have this real opportunity to create characters where you can really interact with the other characters. And so in Asteroids, we've kind of dived much more deeply into the idea of you being not just a character in the story, but you having a role to play. And so in Asteroids, it's diving deeper into the relationship of the two alien characters, Mac and Cheese, and you're a helper robot on the spaceship, and you have these, robot tube-like arms and robot hands. And at various points in the story, you can actually interact with the environment. You can actually help the characters out. You get to, one of the people's favorite parts of the narrative is you get to actually play fetch with the robot dog. So you can grab a ball, and the dog's like super excited to play fetch, just like your dog might be at home. And even though that moment is really ancillary to the story, it's actually important because it helps you build connection with that dog. And then at the very end of Asteroids, you actually work with the dog to potentially save one of the characters' lives. And so that connection becomes important. And so, the hand controllers is really a great way for us to have much deeper types of interactions with the characters in the story. And, we're of course really excited about where that will go. There's technology in terms of tracking your eyes, and all of a sudden we can really differentiate if you're looking at a character but you're really glancing away. That's a huge difference than if you have your eyes really focused on someone. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to have even more sort of more fully integrated user inputs.
How has the sheer ubiquity of video gaming across all age groups helped when it comes to the interactivity and storytelling you guys are doing these days?
Yeah, I mean, what's great is that from games, people already have a strong sense of how you might interact. But one thing that's very different in VR is that unlike a game where you have a controller or you have a mouse and a keyboard, in VR there really is nothing separating you and the characters. And so, for us, that I think is one of the reasons that people actually react in the way they do to Chloe is that there's not this game controller. It's really, you're there, you're part of the world, and the character reacts to you, and somehow because of that, you kind of suspend your disbelief and you actually treat the other characters as if they're real. Which is slightly different than playing a video game, and certainly than seeing something up on screen where there's no expectation that you're going to interact.
And it's interesting because on the gaming world, they've migrated more and more to integrating storytelling into the actual gameplay experience. And in VR, you're integrating more and more interactivity into the storytelling experience. And I'm wondering how that mixture of people you guys have on your team work together to get this right.
Yeah, well, I mean, what's great is that we very early on realized that we needed a strong combination of people who came from, feature film backgrounds and really are cinematographers and storytellers. And at the same time, we needed people who came from really strong game backgrounds and work on AAA games and, really brought that strong sense of interactivity and interaction. But what we're creating, I was always thinking of it is that, you have on one end film, which is not interactive at all. And you have on the other end a fully interactive game that's non-narrative based, and there would be some line drawn between them. Where we end up, who knows? But really, it's like a completely different plane. It's not like drawing on a line. The experiences that we're creating are distinctly, very different and potentially really profoundly, like more engaging than you can get in a film or a game. And so, one of the things that each and every person at Baobab, I think, comes, with is they take with them, sort of their previous experience working on games, working on films, working on other things, but then they come fully ready and excited about being pioneers in a new space and in a new medium. And so it's like on one hand, you have this experience that you bring with you, and on another hand, you kind of have to take that, and all your preconceptions and put it away at the door so that you can, you can be thinking in a different way, and you aren't held back by, well, this is how a game would tackle something, or this is how we do it in a film.
Because in addition to your team creating these experiences, we have LMX Lab and all these other teams out there pushing forward in VR. How is all of this pioneering impacting you guys as you step into new projects?
Well, I think, for us, and for our industry as a whole, one of the things that's really nice in these early days is that we can learn from each other, and everyone is sitting there and experimenting, and so other companies are learning from our experiences, and likewise we're learning from what they're doing. And I think the key is that in this early stage you have to be experimenting and iterating very quickly. So the projects that we work on, we really want to be scoped in such a way that we can release them quickly, that we can actually learn from getting it in front of as many users as possible, and then be able to apply that on our next project.
You mentioned it was 20 years ago that you were first looking at VR. Where do you see even 5 years from now VR being based on the current trajectory?
I mean, I think there's a few things that are really exciting and need to happen. So, one is that from a headset standpoint, the advent of headsets that are going to be lighter in weight, that aren't tethered to a computer, yet still have the same processing power of having inside-out tracking, where you can really track, where your position and orientation is, and the price point that comes down. All of those things are definitely necessary for it to be mass market. And at the same time, the content really needs to be there. And so finding that combination of great content that drives the sales of devices and great devices where you're not constrained into having a big computer and a bulky system, those need to go hand in hand. So I think I'm really excited over the next 5 years to see VR go from that early adopter phase to really where it's something that's mass market, and there is actually a real market for the content that we're creating.
At the same time, we've seen very recently a big push towards augmented and mixed reality, and I want to get your thoughts on where you see VR fitting in that ecosystem.
Yeah, no, we're also really excited about augmented and mixed reality, and for us, we're first and foremost storytellers, and so we want to create great stories and great characters, and we want our characters to get out in the world. And both VR and AR have the potential to be, great platforms for us to tell stories. With VR, you're just transported to faraway places, and we can make those places feel so real that not only you're there, you can reach out and touch them. And with AR, there's amazing opportunity to kind of take our characters out in the real world and integrate them into our everyday world, which is incredibly compelling as well. I think AR is interesting because the technology to do true AR experience is actually much harder. The idea of registering, where your characters are and in your environment is some pretty meaty challenges. And obviously there's some amazing systems that are, already out or in development. And so AR will probably have a longer trajectory, but could potentially have a much bigger impact. And for us, we're really excited to just be storytellers and to be able to sort of have our characters out in both AR and VR.
And the nice thing is all the characters you're creating in this library are in Unreal, and you can use that across all the platforms we're talking about.
Yeah, so I think naively we can take our characters and we can export them to a VR environment and to an AR environment. Of course, what we've found as filmmakers is that the requirements for each are subtly different. And so, for VR, you're kind of immersed in this world, you're part of it fully. And so let's say the scale of a VR experience might be different from that of an AR experience if you're sitting with your iPad and we've been playing around with ARKit, and it's much more of like you have this God's eye view of the world around you. And so the interaction paradigms are slightly different. But the great thing is that if you have characters that are really appealing and you have stories that people are excited to see, then you can take those characters and you can put them into a variety of different contexts. And that's really what we're trying to do at Baobab.